you also for pairing me up with Jennie Stevens, another scholar who I absolutely admire, and I've been reading her book, and it's cutting edge stuff. So thank you so much, and thank you also to the attendance. I've stopped thanking people, but again, looking at who's come, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk about this today. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. So it's sort of, I'll try to talk in somewhat broad terms today, just to think about how we might start conceptualizing the geographies of just transitions. I'll try to take a more, let's say, critical lens and bring maybe aspects of energy, where I've mostly worked in political ecology, and really sort of think about spatiality as well, not in maybe the classic notion of where things are, but sort of try to unpack this. And it's sort of based on work that I've been doing recently and doing at the moment. So it'd be really great to get some feedback from everyone present and a discussion. I mean, the context for some of what I'm talking about is all the proliferation, all these green deals, one of them anyway. So we keep hearing about green deals left, right, and center. Some are more grassroots than others. Some are more radical than others. Some have been very, very strongly co-opted by neoliberal discourses. Some are much more progressive, and so on. So there's a lot happening, and under these green deals, there is a discourse around just energy transitions as well. And invariably, I think if you read these projects, all of them really, is that, you know, there's fundamentally, I would say, socio-spatial projects. So I think that would be one of the arguments I want to put forward today. It's geography is absolutely central to understanding why, how, when, and in what manner really just transitions are articulated. If we say that just transitions sit at the intersection of energy justice and energy transitions, I think what we could also say is that the geographies that they yield, that they create, are unanticipated. There are aspects of space and place that we often don't think about in this context. I'm going to quote my dear colleague and friend Castan Brotto here on particularly her work on landscape, but also issues around scale, around territory, and to just highlight that when we talk about the spatialities of these transitions, they're not just about where things are, about location, but they're about a whole range of other aspects of geography that really go into the minute details, the very mundane details of our everyday lives, and of course then extend to sort of the planetary sphere. And then maybe I'll start thinking also slightly more critically about just transitions. I would say that a lot of the discourses, not necessarily all, but a lot of the discourses around them are fairly neo-modernist, they're capitalocentric, they're patriarchal as well, and they're neoliberal, and many of these discourses remain unchallenged. So I think to understand where we might articulate, and that's, I guess, here the underpinning idea, how we might articulate a progressive just transitions agenda, we need to start challenging these. And I think geography, but geography in a very wide sense as well, is a way to start challenging some of those perspectives. So some of the questions we might ask are, what are the sort of socio-natures of these just transitions that are happening, that are being envisioned, that are being practiced? What are their embodied and what are their possible socio-natures? And also, how might we start thinking about, if we approach justice as a key tenet here, how we might start thinking beyond some of the more traditional optics through which just transitions have been seen, if we're bringing in space. And those tend to be distribution and procedure, but there are other forms of justice, other forms of inequality. And I think, again, the question becomes, how do we bring them into the equation? I'm not going to spend much time talking about just transitions. I just want to acknowledge the fact that there is a long tradition of working in this area. More than 40 years ago, I would say. It started from the notion of green jobs, but it has moved on. It has moved on to questions around climate, environmental justice. It has moved on, as Sheila just enough will argue, into a more inclusive politics, taking in the multiple social foundations of vulnerability, and particularly different axes of difference. And that's, I think, so that's where I think Just Transitions has become a much wider project than it was initially, where, you know, it was mostly around how do we protect particular jobs in particular sector from what might be called green transitions, and that also included things beyond energy. And in the early years, of course, there was the sort of the red-green tension that Just Transition tried to address. And in many ways, we have transcended those tensions, but we are encountering new challenges today. So in the spatialities of Just Transition, I sort of want to put forward a few arguments, and some of these are based on work that I've done with others recently. I think one of the key things that I want to highlight in this maybe more progressive agenda that I'm trying to put forward, might not be a progressive. The test will be, of course, in the discussion that we have and the way that it will be deliberated upon. But one thing that I really want to highlight is that we need to start engaging very deeply with the internal contradictions of capitalism and the household in this sort of in this project. We need to acknowledge that the displacements that transitions create and might create in the future, energy transitions and low carbon ones I'm referring to primarily, they are extensive, and they are not just around particular, you might say, employment patterns or particular places. They are multi-scalar, they're multi-temporal, and of course they extend across different economies. So addressing them requires a much more comprehensive and well thought through approach. And another thing, and I really want to emphasize this, is that when we start talking about the spatialities of Just Transitions, we can't talk about space as a kind of passive container, as just the background in which transitions occur, but quite the opposite. It's an active agent, and it's an active agent in ways that are, as I mentioned before, not always expected or known. And again, that's something that we need to take into account when understanding processes that involve just transitions, but also groups that try to promote them, as well as policies that are implicated in them. And I think here, going particularly in the notion of scale, I think there's a tendency to compartmentalize just transitions in fairly rigid and often somewhat constructed categories around local, global, regional, and so on. Whereas I think what we need to start thinking about when we think about the rescaling or the translocal or the multi-scalar aspects of just transitions, a key aspect of their spatiality, is that process is incredibly messy and involves what Sally Marston would call a flat ontology. I don't fully subscribe to the notion of a flat ontology, but I think that it does contain some very valuable lessons in terms of how we conceptualize scale in particular. So if we start to critique some of these dominant discourses, we might find different ways of doing that. And I should say, I've highlighted a few examples that open the space for thinking, for maybe approaching things slightly differently. Not to say that all of these examples have benefits in themselves and are productive in many ways, but there are challenges. So, for example, the EU has a call right now. Some of you might be involved in it under Horizon, called Accelerating the Climate Transition in Difficult Context, Transition Super Labs. And if you read that that sort of call, which is likely to generate lots of interest at the moment and lots of activity, particularly in just transitions domain, where again lots of funding is coming in, again also from the US government and EU government for various projects. The notion of difficult seems to be seen as a sort of a problem to be solved, almost an engineering challenge, not something that you actually work with the grain of that problem, but quite opposite. And the idea of experimentation here is understood in what Williams and Doyen would say managed decision making rather than inclusive in its very, very messy way. And spatialities again are things where things happen. I would also draw attention to a quote that I found in a book on this subject, a very good book, but the book says we need to achieve justice in the energy sector while preserving the dynamic economic and social forces of progressive capitalist markets. And again, that would sort of be something that I would challenge, because if we accept the idea that the capitalist political economy is actually causing a lot of these injustices, then that finding a compromise and managing it through some sort of spatial strategy, I think is a very, very challenging project and a very contradictory project. And I'm not really sure where that ends up as a process, instead of actually accepting that capitalism and patriarchy and all these sort of racialized inequalities and so on are the problem. So I'm not sure you can fully work with the grain of these systems. You probably is better to work with the grain of the inequalities that they create and embrace them in their messiness. I don't mean to critique my former mentor, who's amazing, but she wrote a book called Fixing Fuel Poverty. A lot of my work is on energy and fuel poverty. And again, the idea that something can be fixed, again, is very present in a lot of these discourses. And it's an engineering approach to, I think, a social challenge. And maybe this is part of the problem. A paper, again, a good paper in many ways, talks on scaling up, talks on low carbon, by Van Doorn and others in Urban Studies, talks about local, regional, global scales, and sort of talks about scales as containers. Again, that sort of scalarity of transition, I think, is much more complex. So anyway, these are sort of I've been trying to, through these examples, show where we might start opening space up for critique. Now, that said, I think there are lots of interesting ideas in which we can move forward. I noticed Feola is in the list of participants, which is amazing, but I think we need to really think about how we sustainability transitions research, which I think has moved on since that paper, but how we embody the spatial and political economies of capitalism inside it. I think also when we talk about, I'm really inspired by Maria Kaika's work on what she calls immunological sanctity. And we can't think of just transition as sort of immunological projects in which we protect group A and group B or place A or place B from the deleterious effects of a transition. That's, again, a very problematic project. And again, in her other work, where she talks about procedure recognition, even recognition actually in distribution, as needing to be not just the only principles of justice. So talking really about things like socio-ecological justice, political justice, restorative justice, and so on, I think is really vital. I realize I don't have much time, so I'm going to speed through these examples. I have a few very quick examples of organizations that are approaching these and working with the grain of these messy spatial contingencies. I've been working for a while now with the Right to Energy Coalition, which is an amazing trans-European group that connects all sorts of activists from trade unions, from environmental campaigners, housing providers. And if you look at what they do, they are strategic about transitions, but they also constantly deliberate on the real challenges about bringing everything together in sort of the low carbon justice world. And everything that they do constantly is a process of deliberation, discussion, and engaging with that spatial messiness, and also being strategic, which I think is very important. Some of my other work has dealt with the concept, some of the problem of renovation, which is something that we're beginning to see a lot under the guise of also of a just transition. So where you're saying, right, there's this wonderful private rented sector, dwellings, houses, perfect. So let's increase their energy efficiency, particularly if low income people live there. Brilliant. So that's a just transition, isn't it? Well, not quite, because what ends up as a result of that is you've got gentrification, and you've also got often eviction due to higher rents. And so looking at groups that have challenged renovictions is really interesting. And they've done it across the world. There was a really interesting action in Stockholm several years ago. There's a photo of the theater that was occupied. relation to a project called Grow Smarter, which paradoxically caused a lot of evictions and challenges precisely in that area, just south of the city centre of Stockholm. So again, thinking about community organizing, thinking about occupation, thinking about contestation is really the core of the just transition for me, and not the sort of the managed decision making, and thinking about its implications across these multiple spatial contexts. This is another action I believe in Vancouver that's done similar work. There's lots of interesting community groups in the US that are doing similar work. I will highlight the work of LISC in New York, and it's a national foundation where, again, looking at the multifamily weatherization assistance program, they don't implement it just in a sort of technical way. They go in, work with the residents, they ask what the challenges are, they look at the differences beyond the household and inside the household, and they work with the ecosystem of energy actors involved. So again, this is all about integrating difference and diversity and challenging often the foundations of the system. Right, so I've been trying to be quite brief and also keep to time. So what are sort of the implications? And I realize I've kept this quite general, and I suppose partly intentionally so, because I do want to open up the space for discussion and see where we might go with a project that's a little bit more aware of the contradictions of capital and inequality, the very foundations of them. Elizabeth Shoves took us about understanding the politics of the present, and I think that's very important here. Thinking about what sort of adaptive opportunities do these projects engender, I think is absolutely crucial. Understanding the spatialities of just transition. So this is in a sense the notion of makings and becomings that Lefebvre would put forward. So not a linear process, and just transitions cannot be a process when we bring in that spatial perspective where you move from A to B. It's a process that involves many outcomes and often unsuccessful outcomes, and that's okay, because we learn from the unsuccessful outcomes, but also we see where the challenges are in the system. We really need to think about just transitions not as things that are just for the workers or just for particular regions, although the workers are important, and the understanding of what the workers are is really important, particularly in terms of social reproduction that occurs across a variety of forms of labor. So Doshi's work on embodied, gendered, racialized, everyday forms of difference, but also circulatory, given that we are intervening in all sorts of metabolisms that enroll socio-natural configurations in new ways, especially if you're talking about sustainability and inequality in a radically different technological system. I like the idea of low carbon initiatives as junctions, where you are creating new forms of network urbanism, and you are also creating new demands on climate and energy actors. And all of the actors I've given you have embodied that sort of paradox of being both strategic and disruptive at the same time. And that's, I think, a must in these days. And understanding how that dichotomy works when you're trying to bring forth a just transition is very interesting. And I think, in essence, that's been my argument today, that it does lead us to really rethink justice, rethink transition, and introduce a non-conformist praxis. And I'm hoping that we will start going down that line. I've given some examples, but I'm sure that the people here who are attending will have many more. And with that, I'm very grateful again for the opportunity, and thank you for listening. Cheers.
All right. Well, thank you, Stefan. Thank you so much for that provocative and critical integration of a lot of different really important ideas here. And I especially appreciate at the end an invitation, right, for all of us to expand our thinking toward a more non-conformist, is a nice way to put it. So thank you for that. I've put together a few thoughts that I'll just share. I think I'm going to go ahead and put a slide up just to be provocative and engaging here. briefly, just to juxtapose what Stefan just mentioned with a few other thoughts. And I really appreciate the subheading, doing things differently, right? Like, we know we have to do things differently. And I think one of the things that I'm curious about is how to connect these ideas and what we're doing as academics in this space with this concentration of wealth and power and the idea of the polluter elite who are very strategically for decades resisting transitions, right? They don't want a transformation. So it's not, we need to be engaged with these power dynamics in new and different ways. And I think that's also part of your invitation here to do that. And I put up, you mentioned, I put up my book, not to self-promote, but given that it has catalyzed lots of new conversations, I wanted to just mention that this idea of integrating power and discussions of power and who's being included, who's being excluded, and this idea of anti-racist feminist leadership or the principles of anti-racism and feminism, which in my view really just means constantly paying attention to the power dynamics and historical legacy issues as well, of who's been privileged and who has been disadvantaged. And I think that's central to your request of all of us to acknowledge how so many of our transition processes have not challenged the visions of patriarchal neoliberal discourse. And I think we have a lot of opportunity here to connect also with the energy democracy framing, which is explicitly about resisting the problematic systems, reclaiming and then restructuring, right? And I think that's helpful to connect with the transitions framing. And I think the other thing that I really appreciated your point about the, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a minute. Your point about the critique of the recent, I think it was an EU solicitation for accelerating the climate transition in difficult contexts, as if, you know, there's a non-difficult context, right? That would be more ideal. But I think, again, this idea of the challenge and the cost and how hard it's going to be to transition is a narrative that we also can flip on its head and say we have an opportunity, right, for a regenerative, healthy future. And I think that's where some of the New Deal, Green New Deal, these different political visions of transformation are really thinking about what do we need for a prosperous, healthy society. And it's clear with this share of national income and share of national wealth and this, you know, we're going in the wrong direction, right, toward that. And maybe this pandemic has really been the disruptive moment to, that has changed some of our, or revealed, I guess, some of the really problematic structures and policies and processes and priorities that we have. So I think that's exciting to be thinking about in a different way of kind of the opportunity for connecting all of these things together, not just climate, not just energy, but jobs and economics and health and education and housing. And it's when we link all of these challenges together where we can get to the more transformative possibilities. I also wanted to just acknowledge and appreciate your critique also of the fixing and solving language, right? That is very appealing. It's something that I also try to resist or push back when, you know, climate solutions, right, is a big framing that people, and the idea of having a solution and then a problem that you can define and fix is very appealing. And it lends itself to too simplistic, as you point out. So I think that's very, very helpful there. The examples you gave, obviously it would be great to get more detail, and you did a great job, like providing specifics yet in a very short time frame. So thank you for that. And I guess the other thing I will mention is a couple of things. One, the idea of displacement is really helpful, I think, and it helps us think beyond just the spatial way of thinking about things, but also over time and economic displacement. And I think that relates to the economic injustices that we're seeing. And it's a helpful way to connect with both transition and disruption and helpful there. So I think I'll end by just saying that I think you raise kind of a fundamental question about incremental versus radical change, right? And this is what a lot of us in this transition transformation space are struggle with in all different kinds of ways, right? It's good to see progress and see some change in a certain direction. Yet when we don't have the ambition for larger transformation, small incremental changes can actually slow us down, right, from the bigger, larger change. So I think that's also a really important thing for us all to be thinking about. So thank you for those remarks. And if there's anything you want to specifically refer to, I guess particularly I'm curious about your, how you see or what you might want to connect with in terms of the legacy, systemic, patriarchal, even white supremacist, kind of systems that we're all operating in, and how we can resist those in our academic work, as you call for a more praxis. Kind of what can we all be doing differently in our research and our academic work, and how we engage. So thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jennie. You know, my computer started overheating as you were talking, and that's just like all the ideas you've given us are absolutely amazing, and all the questions you've raised. And we need more of the kinds of interventions that you've given in terms of your book as well, and the debate that you're creating. I think there's a radical shift that you are opening up, and that's a classic example of what is radical. So thank you for raising those. There was one question, if maybe I can just answer that question in the chat, and I think that connects also to what you're saying. And I think a very important part of all of this is recognition justice. And recognition justice can also be instrumentalized. It's not like the solution for everything. It's not a panacea by any means. But one thing we do need to understand, and I'm sorry if I wasn't very articulate on that. I sort of sped through everything quite fast. But one thing we do need to articulate through what recognition does helps us understand, first of all, recognizing difference, recognizing positionality, recognizing the mechanisms that create inequality, but also recognizing whose voices are represented and whose voices are not represented. And connects. There was also a question around business, and one of the problems that I find in my practice, and I do a lot of advocacy work as well, is that you organize a seminar on just transition, and the room is chock full of lobbyists. And so in fact the lobbyists for companies wanting to shape the process in a particular way. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily that's how the system works. It's very problematic, of course, though, in many ways, but we don't have enough of the voice of those people who are often most affected and often most active in many ways at the coalface of effectuating change. So yeah, opening up the space, and I think also recognition has an element of passivity to it, and that's I think injustice as a whole has an element of passivity to it, which is why I like what you brought. Well, I like the idea that you brought forward of energy democracy, because it's also not just about us, who tend to be on various axes on a relatively more privileged position, telling people, oh well, you'll be recognized, but it's also about really opening the space for all sorts of contestations that come from the grassroots and challenge ways of thinking and ways of doing. And again, if you look at what a lot of organizations are doing at multiple scales, that's happening, but they directly clashes with the notion, just as you said, of a managed process, and that a managed process closes often those openings that are created from the bottom up. And if I can be a little bit provocative here, just as a means also opening up the discussion, I often find that the discourse of the sort of the tension between incremental and radical, while it is of course something that all of us face in all of our activities, if we start changing our frame, perhaps, and I'm not even sure that I can articulate that properly now, but maybe that's a collective project that we can all articulate through discussion. If we start changing our frame of mind, maybe there's ways of being both incremental and both what's understood as incremental and radical. And in fact, what a lot of people are doing on the ground is being that. If I think of the activists, like, if I think of the Right to Energy Coalition, they're working in the law, so they are bringing about very incremental changes in. Right now, there's a number of directives that they're influencing, and you think, okay, it's just a few words in this directive and a few words in that directive of the EU and that law, and it looks like a small step. It's not a radical step, right, by any sort of, it's not a revolution, it's not tearing down these neoliberal institutions, but it's throwing a spanner in the works. And that spanner in the works that's been carefully thought through, often through many radical initiatives leading up to that point. And I'm not saying that and the radical initiatives are also continuing. That spanner in the works then creates displacements of all kinds, displacements that then later down the line, in a sort of a more medium to long term, really challenge everything. The fact that we still are talking about just transitions now, that it's become a mainstream concern. Where was just transitions or Green Deals 5 years ago? Nobody, it wasn't in the mainstream discourse. Now it's entered the mainstream. It's being co-opted, but nevertheless, as a language, as a discourse, it's there. So it creates then an opening for radical political change. So I think, so that in that sense, that spatiality also concerns where and how these terms are inserted and what their implications on discourse and the whole of the political imagination are. I think that's very, very important.
Thanks, Stefan. Also, thanks, Jennie, of course, for a great presentation and also a great discussion. And I think I saw you already secretly answering some of the questions that came up in the Q&A, and I want to continue a bit with those. So I think you were already starting to address the question of Emilie Etienne related to a transformational potential versus just contributing to incremental changes. But I was interested in two related questions that I saw popping up there as well. And the first one is from Lars Koene. And Lars Koene asks about what alternatives are on offer to go beyond climate and energy solutions and terms like fixing that you mentioned. And then there's also a related question from Emil Evenhuis considering policy. And he asked, I'm also curious about any concrete recommendations for policy that follow from these presentations. What should policymakers do, prioritize at that moment if they want to enact just transitions? So please go ahead, whoever, Stefan, maybe.
I'm very happy because I spoke for quite long. I'd be quite curious to hear from Jennie. Then I'm looking at some of the other questions as well, and I could answer them as well. So
I guess I could speak to the question about I think it was how to constructively engage. Was that the first question you asked about how to kind of not convince or get people on your side to think about this intersectional anti-capitalist view of transitions? And I think one of the ways that I think has been very effective, again, is this linking the challenges together and pointing out demonstrating how things are interconnected. And I guess this speaks to the other question about the fixing and solving language. Again, having a more optimistic view of a kind of very different future that simultaneously addresses multiple challenges, right, that we're facing, and pointing out the very positive outcomes for everybody. It is kind of one way to address that. But obviously it's given how our mindset in so many of these discourses is quite ingrained, and people are comfortable with and assume that to kind of continue with the way people have been thinking about these climate and energy solutions, that it's a challenge. And one of the things that I try to highlight is that we will actually not be successful in addressing or the scale of the challenge until and unless we are able to be more intersectional and be more inclusive and connect with more people and what people really are worried about in their lives.
Thank you. Stefan, maybe can you add something about the policy recommendations or prioritizations that should follow from this, from your presentation?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we start thinking about policy, I would look at a lot of the discourse, the language in which just transitions are framed, and I would really, like, if policymakers want to bring in, how should I say, if they really want to bring in genuine just transitions, then there has to be lots of disruption to the system. You can't implement just transitions, so there has to be a political will to do them. That's the first problem. So there's no sort of, I would argue that there is not a technocratic or a managed approach that is also not inherently political in itself. Every approach is political, and so because we're shying away from politics in policy making, the result is we end up with policies that reinforce not only the status quo, but make things worse. With the discourse of a difficult region, which Jennie picked up on, that's already a very stigmatizing discourse, and it's, whatever those projects will do and the regions that will be selected will do, they will already be branded as difficult. So just think of that. And so, one thing I'd say is, and I see this across all of the projects that I do, the moment we start trying to make very transformative and deep changes, we're stepping on someone's toes. And in a recent project where we're looking at the regulation of particular types of housing and bringing in different policies in the very political arena, immediately we had huge pressure from particular policy groups. So ultimately, a good policy is one that recognizes its political groundedness, and it has to come with particular values, political values, and political ideas. And this is something, what I find very problematic, that's what I want to say, is the idea that there is a policy that can work and that can meet everyone's, that can sort of meet, that can be inclusive of everyone's interests. If you want to break the status quo, you're going to have to go against some deep vested interests. And so, I mean, I'm going to stop here because I could go on. Is it okay if I answer another question in the Q&A?
Yes.
Which is coming through quite a lot. And I think as a critique I recognize is that I realize I've given a very global North presentation. And it's also partly because I don't feel fully comfortable at this stage to be giving presentations about the global South. I mean, I've done projects in Africa and in China and so on, but I also recognize that the circumstances around just transitions in countries that one doesn't entirely speak the language of or doesn't fully understand the local context of are always different. I think what maybe we can do, I've done this in my energy poverty work, is we need to articulate a global language of solidarity. That's missing from the debate. But beyond that, understanding just transition has to be has to understand local specificities, or not local, at least the sort of place-based challenges that every context faces. And I'm not just talking that the specificities of the global south are somehow special. They're special also in the global north. It's just that we need to understand them in particular contexts. What we are still missing is really what are the standards, what are the expectations we expect globally in a sort of global spatially articulated commons around just transition. And that's something that we are missing in the debate.
I would just follow up briefly on both the policy question and the developing world versus developed world question. In terms of, I think what we're getting at is not, I mean, the complexities of how specific policies are designed and developed and implemented, but the fundamental behind the policies need to be resisting and reducing fossil fuel reliance, right? Number one. And I mean, not number one, but among, and investing in people and communities and households so that people have not just sufficiency, but can thrive, right? And that's where we've gotten ourselves complacent about exploitative, extractive systems, right? And thinking that somehow that's okay, that's the way it's been, so that's the way it can continue. And that's where the resistance is needed, right? To point out that is not okay. We need bigger change in how we can't have sacrifice zones or sacrifice communities, right? We need to acknowledge the harms and then repair and invest in new and different ways. And I think that's where the real shift in climate policy is moving toward, instead of talking about carbon tax and decarbonization, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and having it all about that. There is this shift toward investing in people and communities and jobs and housing, and that is an opportunity again, and a way to get toward larger change, but also, as Stefan pointed out, it's very political, right? Because a lot of interests don't want that, right? And are trying to stop those kinds of new ways of designing policy. And I think that holds true, obviously, different countries, different contexts, but some of the same kind of principles in the policies are important and relevant everywhere around the world.
Thank you. Maybe I can also ask a question, maybe a bit related, also maybe about bridging between fields, between transition communities, and maybe more critical geographical approaches. And we all know that transition community is maybe rooted in the Dutch consensus style politics from 20 years ago. And there's also, of course, now much more radical approaches, and also relating to the question of Bart Haagsma. So how do you strike a balance between these approaches? Is this even possible? And how is there a balance between sharp observations and critique, while on the other hand trying to be relevant? Stefan.
Yeah, I can say something. I think it's a really, I think it strikes at the core of the debate. And looking at all of these questions, I'm overwhelmed. I'm thinking maybe we could, like, where's the post-seminar drinks or something where we can talk, because there's so many amazing questions. But I'm not sure. I think there's a big challenge here around the reconciliation of different approaches. I do find the managed, the sort of, I would be critical of anything that's, and I know that there is a particular policy tradition that, and I acknowledge that, an intellectual tradition that comes there, but I've been critical of that idea of a managed, but also, I would say, rather naive understanding of a transition that also primarily focuses on innovation. And that's, I think, one of the challenges that we have, is that we've understood transitions mainly through the lens of innovation. And I would say also a very aspatial lens, because, niche and landscape and so on, they have been translated into spatial categories in, I would say, they tended to be, not everyone, and there are very many sophisticated analyses now, but they have tended to be seen, often I see that in a very, very rigid and quite simplistic terms. So, you know, I think it's really very important that we start having this conversation. But I cannot see a way forward unless we recognize that transitions have to be disruptive, and transitions can't go around the elephant in the room. That is a fundamental problem. Everything that's being done, so much of what's being done in just transitions now is trying to work with the grain of the system and find ways of, you know, and it goes going back to Jennie and what Jennie was saying, you know, basically just ignore the polluting big interests that continue to thrive in one condition or the other, and that you can't work with that. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that I, as an academic, I'm going to go down and bring these corporations down, but I think we have to be, our work has to be able to expose where those inequalities are coming, where the tensions arise in just transitions. That's what we can do. We can show what happens. We can show potentially where synergies are. And again, you know, I worked with the European Commission until very recently on an observatory for energy poverty, and that's, you know, that is, you know, you could say I basically directly connected to the policymakers and then acknowledged the language. But working there, I could see that there are openings even in a structure like that. But I think my work, or our work, has to be as researchers primarily to find where those tensions are and exposing where those tensions are. There's some really interesting projects now, and we have to find them. We have to elevate them. We have to show ways of doing things differently.
And I would just add that I think we have to think about our own inclusivity, right, as academics, and acknowledge, and this is what I think many of us are realizing more and more, that the traditions and what we've done so far has been constrained by who's been involved, right? Who is coming up with these ideas of climate and energy transitions, and who is not involved in the conversation. So one of the things I like to challenge us all to think about when I talk about anti-racist feminist principles in our work, it shouldn't just be women who embrace feminist principles, yeah, and people of color who embrace anti-racism. We all need to be engaging and acknowledging these power structures at every level and at every scale and at every interaction that we have as researchers as well, right? And our institutions, and how we engage with non-academics and communities and policies and all of that. So I think we have opportunities for, Stefan was critiquing the word innovation, but innovating, you know, how we prioritize what we can do in our academic space, and what kinds of mechanisms that we can do to broaden our own networks and opening up, being more inclusive ourselves, and recognizing how we, you know, the history is not very inclusive. So we're missing a lot, I guess, by not being as inclusive and diverse as we could be.
Thanks. Yeah, we are almost at the end already, so we only have a couple of minutes left. So maybe some final thoughts on maybe also conceptually where this could be heading in terms of spatial conceptualizations of energy justice. So what should be next things to focus on, and where can we really work from here?
Yeah, I'm happy to just give a few comments. I think so. If we go back to the geographies of this, you know, geography itself is really evolving at the moment as a discipline. So, you know, there's three things that are changing, you know, understandings of energy justice, transitions research, and human geography. And, you know, there's changes in all of these three, which we need to bring together, I think, in a more, if we're going to put forward a more radical understanding. So democracy, I think energy democracy is one key aspect. Everything, I think generally feminist political economies, feminist ecologies are really the vanguard in terms of how we understand spatial differences. And also all of this whole wider panoply of studies around social exclusion, from critical race studies to a whole range of other approaches. I'm also here talking about the wider notion of sort of critical development studies. So, I mean, we have quite a difficult project in a sense to rethink what I think can be quite a rigid, quite a simplistic understanding of, you know, we can just say, just transitions happen there, they're difficult, you need to bring in all these different actors and, you know, like a really, I would say, containerized understanding of space to a much more pluralized, much more inclusive, much more challenging in terms of challenging power structures, understanding of space. But that's the only way forward. I think that's where the line of discussion should be.
Many thanks. Jennie, some final conceptual directions that you can take us?
Very quickly, I would just say, you know, this is an exciting time for this integration, right, of all these different ways of thinking about society. And it's also a disruptive time where, you know, the window of opportunity for accelerating transformation. There was a question about urgency. And I think, you know, it's not just the climate that's urgent, so many other issues. And by focusing on transformation for the future, for prosperity, for sustainability, it's an exciting time for lots of opportunities to be involved in collective action. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, then, again, I would like to thank our speaker and discussant. Many thanks for your contribution. I would like to thank the audience as well. And then there is, of course, the next seminar is next week. And then we will talk about green industrial path developments. And yeah, there will be, as you know, more sessions to come in the coming weeks. So yeah, we really hope you enjoyed the session, you enjoyed the stimulating discussion we had today, and we hope to see you in the coming weeks as well, where we will discuss a lot of more different topics related to the combination of geography and sustainability transitions. Thank you very much.